Hi. So, a couple of things before I get started. Number one, I'm super excited to be able to be here. Patrick and Karen have been such a big part of the Harry Potter Studies division at Southwest for so long, and I'm glad that I'm finally able to sort of return the favor and come out and do this. If you do like what you hear today, if you like doing this kind of stuff, if you're interested in academics and nerding out over the things you love, you should check out our podcast that we've got going on. The Deconstruction Workers is a bi-weekly podcast where I sit down with some of the, greatest academic minds in the country, and we kick around things in their area. So the Harry Potter talk is me and Lauren, and we've there's an entire episode about that. We talk Hamilton, we talk toys, we talk professional wrestling, we talk all kinds of stuff. So you can find it on iTunes, on Stitcher, Google Play, wherever you get your podcast stuff. So please check us out. That is not what I came here to talk to you about today. What I came to talk to you about today is white people. So let's do that. In order for me to talk to you about the thing that I need to talk to you about, we have to sort of define critical whiteness theory. What is critical whiteness theory? What do I mean by critical whiteness? Well, what I mean by that is, first, it's important to recognize a few things about Western popular culture. Now, I'm gonna say some stuff right now that it would take me an entire semester to sort of lay out for you, so you're gonna have to trust me for a second, okay? A couple of things about Western popular culture as a thing. Number one, in the West, Anglo-European culture is what we call normative. That is, it becomes the default for what we think of as mainstream. So when we talk about what mainstream popular culture is, that is necessarily the culture that appeals to white people, particularly within the United States, but in Western culture in general. It is what we call the normative cultural status. Also, because it is the normative cultural status, what it positions whiteness as is superior. And it positions non-white cultures as inferior. There's a whole litany of reasons for this, but essentially what it boils down to is this. We have a need as a person, as a human being, you have a need, a necessity to think of yourself as loved and accepted and a part of a group and the inside of a tribe. And the more like you someone is, the more you accept them as a part of your tribe. So the people who look like me, dress like me, act like me, talk like me, are part of my tribe. Now, I also have a necessity to believe my tribe is the good guys. So we are smart and beautiful and kind and awesome and all of the good things in life. Which necessarily means if you don't look like me, dress like me, talk like me, act like me, think like me, you also cannot possibly be good and kind and smart and beautiful and all the good things, because if you were those things, you would be like me, and you're not. So we are the good guys, we are the pure and original people, and you are the other with a capital O. And we push you to the outside. And if the inside tribe is whiteness, everyone who is not that is necessarily inferior. They're on the outside of the tribe, okay? The combination of these two things, the combination of white dominance in terms of discourse within the culture and mainstreaming, that is normatizing, leads to whiteness being taken for granted within the culture. It becomes the default. It creates a situation where whiteness becomes the way we think about culture. Except One of the benefits of being in the privileged, dominant discourse position is that nobody's allowed to talk about whiteness. Part of the privilege of privilege is never having to admit that you have privilege. Now, it is at this point in this particular lecture that in your eyeballs, I can see for some of you going, well, I don't believe in white privilege. And what I say to you is, nobody cares what you believe. Saying you don't believe in white privilege is like saying you don't believe in turtles. Turtles don't care if you believe in them. Turtles go on about their turtle business. And whiteness operates whether you look at it or don't look at it. It doesn't matter. It still does what it does. So, because whiteness is central, it becomes invisible. There's a really famous quote by a guy named Marshall McLuhan, and he said, "I don't know who discovered water, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't a fish." That's the way whiteness operates in a society. If you're in it, you can't see it. But people who are not in it see it all the time. And it's culturally invisible, it's socially invisible, it's politically invisible, and most importantly, it's economically invisible. So you've got this privilege that is blind, not just to the privilege it's created by, but to the privilege it continues to perpetually create. So it's got this vicious circle going on inside that's invisible. And that is why in our culture it allows for the conflation of whiteness with existing social norms and values and structures and institutions. It conflates whiteness with the status quo, which then allows people to say things like success is based on effort and equal opportunity. Well, no, it isn't. Because it's based on this cycle of institutionalized privilege that the privileged people made invisible. And if you really want to know how it works, stick around. Now, there are some typical reactions to critical whiteness theory. It's easy to catalog them because they are so very common. The first is, I am disappointed. The second is, I am very sad. And the third is, you go directly to hell. Those reactions are very, very common. It makes sense as we transform whiteness into a real social category that we are necessarily forced to then look at. The problem with making whiteness a real social category is that in our culture, social categories, the discourse in our culture about social identity categories has necessarily been disadvantagement. When we talk about distance from the cultural norm center, it's always in terms of disadvantagement. Blind people don't get to be blind in our culture. They have to overcome their blindness. Women, the fact that women have vaginas is seen in this culture as a detriment. So much so that you get to use your period as an excuse because it's distanced from the norm. We do it in every one of our identity categories. Gay people are deviant, and so on and so forth. Well, in terms of whiteness, that positions race of any kind that doesn't carry with it white skin as an immediate disadvantage, particularly within this particular culture. And so because racial politics and racial media representations of those politics are wrapped around social disadvantagement, when you turn whiteness into a social category, white people start looking for, well, where is my disadvantagement? And so they invent disadvantagements. Reverse racism, or I don't like quotas, or affirmative action is terrible, or you don't want me to say that, you just want me to be politically correct. And what I always tell people when they use that phrase is, there is no political correctness. You're either an asshole or you're not. There's no political correctness. That's not a thing. What you're really saying is, I would be more racist and sexist, but you're standing right there. So, when we begin to strip away these ideas about what racial identity actually means, we can then talk about white ethnic identity. Without, by the way, retreating into European ethnic identity, which in contemporary United States is irrelevant. It's literally irrelevant. But my ancestors were Irish and they were oppressed. Yeah, Irish is not an oppressive category in the United States in 2018. But it's supposed to be your racial disadvantage, so that's where you go. So, if you want to see, like many, many, many things, as we have talked about all day today and will talk about all day tomorrow, if you want to see how these things operate, do I got a guy for you. Harry Potter is an instructive model for engaging in critical whiteness studies due to the overwhelming amount of privilege Harry Potter benefits from throughout the entirety of the series. And, by the way, the manner in which this privilege is continually explained away by the white author. So, let's look at it and see what we're dealing with. As I said at the beginning, Harry Potter has 4 dimensions of his white privilege. There's a cultural dimension, a social dimension, a political dimension, and an economic dimension. So let's go through them one by one, and let's start with the big one. Here's my very simple question to you. Where does all of Harry Potter's money come from? If you answered any question that positions yourself as someone who knows, stop it. Harry Potter's money comes from the mysterious double fortune that he is an heir to before the story even begins. Nobody talks about at all within the context of the canonical story, and someone this morning was talking about canon. Within the canonical story, there is zero explanation of Harry Potter's money. None. The second he is admitted to Hogwarts, he gets money as a part of the deal. As a matter of fact, the first time they talk about it at all, when Harry's just a little dude, Harry said, Hagrid shows up, right? Hagrid, by the way, the bravest man I ever knew. Albus Severus Dumbledore, yeah, man. That kid's name is Hagrid. But I digress. The first time Hagrid shows up and says, "You're a wizard, Harry," the first thing Harry says immediately is, "I don't have any money. I got no money, and Uncle Vernon will not pay for me to go." And Hagrid says, "Don't you worry about that. Do you think your parents didn't leave you anything?" And we find out, oh, his parents left him something. They left him a giant, billowing, green, smoke-filled vault full of mounds of gold coins, columns of silver, heaps of little bronze canutes. "All yours," smiled Hagrid. And Harry understands the immense privilege that brings because he has grown up with nothing. And he knows if the Dursleys knew about his money, they would have taken it from him. So his parents specifically hid his money from his relatives, or more importantly, Dumbledore specifically hid Harry's money from his relatives, so that when it was time for him to come to the Wizarding World, he could come to the Wizarding World in the position he was always meant to. His spot was saved for him. We'll come back to that. Then Harry goes to Hogwarts. He has a bunch of adventures. His teacher tells him, hey, if anyone flies while I'm gone out of the room, you're gonna get expelled. And then Harry's like, broomstick. And then, does Harry get expelled? Of course not. Harry gets to play on his school's football team, which we are told has not happened in 100 years. And then his punishment for having broken the rules that would have gotten anyone else expelled is that his head of house buys him. She sends him the latest broomstick and specifically tells him, don't open it in front of other kids because they all know that's some trash. That you get stuff for a thing that would have gotten anyone else expelled. And we could have conversations about Brock Turner, but we're not gonna. And then he says, at the end of Prisoner of Azkaban, right? Actually, at the beginning of Prisoner of Azkaban, when Harry's getting ready to go on the train back to school, he's got to swing by his vault so that he could get some money, and he had to exercise self-control so he didn't take more money than he was supposed to. The part I left out, by the way, of this is when Harry, on the train, buys up all the snacks on the trolley so him and Ron can eat it, and my first question in reading that was, what about the kids in the next car over? Who get nothing now because Harry literally bought it all. And one of the laws is you can't create food out of nothing. So once it's gone, and it's all Harry's. So much so that they throw it out the window, by the way. Then Harry's broomstick gets destroyed at the end of Prisoner of Azkaban, but that's cool, because you know who else got money? Sirius Black, who sends Harry a firebolt, which is the brand new, newest thing on the planet. He could feel it vibrating. It was exactly perfect. Who sent it to you, said Ron. Harry says, I don't know, people just send me stuff. My life is dope and I do dope shit. And then Ron looks at him in his face and says, who would spend money like that on you? Because Ron is poor and he gets it in a way that Harry never has to. Then later, Sirius says, oh, by the way, I didn't tell you, I was the one who sent you the firebolt. But I made them take the gold from my own vault so that people didn't know that it was your money. So it's all good. You're fine. Sirius literally explains Potter's privilege away for him, so he doesn't have to deal with it. He doesn't have to deal with his friends. Then, in Goblet of Fire, Harry wins the equivalent of like $250,000, and Harry's like, take it, I don't want it. And he hands it to the Weasley twins, who are like, this is the most money anyone I know has ever seen ever. And Harry's like, what am I gonna do, put it with the rest? Like, take it, it's yours, I don't want it. There's 1,000 galleons in there, and Harry's like, yup, that's how I do. Then we get to the part where we really begin to see the economic power of the Potters when we find out that Harry Potter inherits the one thing that every person in history, particularly American history, got to have, which is, his slave. When he shows up at Sirius Black's house and then he's like, Creature, come here. And Creature doesn't have a choice. He has to come because he is bound to Harry's family. By the way, not his actual blood family, his adopted family. Now, I'm an adoptive father, so please don't take this as a slight against adoption. My daughter is adopted. This isn't a slight against adoption. This is the slight against inheriting people, just by proxy. So, as we begin to move out of that economic privilege into the political privilege of Harry Potter, we begin to look at all of the ways that whiteness gets Harry Potter out of trouble, over and over and over. Whether it's Polyjuice Potion, whether it's the invisibility cloak, the Marauders map, teachers randomly covering for him, including Dumbledore. It's all the ultimate in invisible political privilege. Harry Potter never, not once, in 7 books, has to actually accept responsibility for anything he does. Harry blows up his aunt, runs out of the house, gets on the night bus, is running away from home. The president of the country redirects his bus to safety, pulls Harry aside, and Harry is expecting his punishment, and he learns the value of his white privilege immediately when Fudge is like, nah, it's cool. And Harry literally says, I broke the law, and Fudge says, not the real laws. That's the laws for people who aren't Harry Potter. What few detentions he does incur for his behavior are typically benign. Harry Potter literally almost murders Draco Malfoy. And people are like, that's what happens around here. People almost get murdered in bathrooms. And it happens like 7 times in the series. That's just what happens. In Prisoner of Azkaban, Harry gets the Marauders map, which is literally the most dangerous magical artifact in the history of the Hogwarts, because it gives you so much information about the precise location of things. And even Ron is like, why does that go to you and not me? Because within Rowling's story, and this is something we were talking about over at the table out here this morning, in the story, Rowling substitutes blood status for having to talk about the fact that she doesn't write black characters. And in that construct, Ron is positioned then as an ethnic minority within that story, because his family is Irish. And within that British culture, that then makes him the ethnic minority, right? So Ron is always our voice of like, I get that there's racism going on, which never, by the way, comes out of the mouths of guys like Dean Thomas or Lee Jordan, because then she actually has to deal with racism. So actual racial minorities never talk about that. They never talk about how Padma Patil is literally described in Goblet of Fire as the most beautiful girl in school until Hermione throws on a dress and puts her hair up. We don't talk about that kind of stuff because we put that racial narrative in the mouths of another white person so that we can have that conversation amongst ourselves, not with the people who might actually want to have it. So, you've got that going on. In Deathly Hallows, Harry has so much political privilege that he gets to sass the Minister of Magic. The president shows up and is like, I'm questioning you. And he's like, no, you're not. And then Scrimgeour goes, oh yeah, maybe I'm not. There's no consequence for that. Every time Harry receives an actual punishment, it is couched in this knowledge that it is some sort of gross miscarriage of justice. The one time he receives actual corporal punishment, it is played as though it is torture to him when he has to write lines with Umbridge's pen, and it tortures him. And weirdly enough, just leave it. It's cool. Weirdly enough, she is the only person who legitimately holds him accountable. And she's played as the villain of all villains. Umbridge is actually a bigger villain than Voldemort. Because Voldemort is a villain with a plan and Umbridge is hateful for no reason, and there's a difference. Those of you who are Dungeons and Dragons people, yeah, Voldemort is lawful evil. Umbridge is chaotic evil. Big difference, huge difference. Harry is never punished with real consequences for anything he does. Consider that he literally gets Sirius Black killed. Literally, it's his fault entirely, 100%. Hermione even tells him that in the context of the story, and Dumbledore explains that away for him so that he doesn't have to deal with those consequences either. That's political power. The third sphere is cultural power. Now, Harry, as Great White Hero, has two different spheres of this sort of power. The first is his wizard privilege, which is necessarily the privilege of whiteness, because the vast majority of wizards are white. So those two things get conflated. So Harry's privilege as a wizard gives him power over the house elves, over the centaurs, over the giants, but he gets the second privilege category internally to the narrative of also being pureblood. His mother is a Muggle-born, but he is born of two wizarding parents, which then makes him, within the community, pureblood, based on their own flawed logic. Every time Harry's place in society is unquestioned, which it is, both of his best friends in the trio structure, they have their positions questioned all the time. Hermione is a mudblood. She is Muggle-born. Racial slurs are, the equivalent of racial slurs are hurled at her the entirety of that narrative. Ron is a blood traitor, which is the same thing within that wizarding world. He's a Muggle lover. Harry's position of privilege is never actually invoked at all. They talk about Harry in terms of him being an enemy. They talk about Harry in terms of him being a public problem, but they only do that in relationship to Voldemort, not in relationship to his own blood status, which again removes the question of whiteness from the table. It takes that part of the narrative out of the equation. And it's particularly salient when Ron is the one who finally points out, no one ever questions Harry. If we think about the fact that his place in society was waiting for him since before he was born, his legal guardians, the only actual parents he has ever known, this family who, by the way, who had to live with a Horcrux in their house for 11 years, this family that has raised him has no say whatsoever in where he goes to school. They have no say. His place has been put down for him since before he was born, and he's going whether you like it or not. Hagrid tells him in no uncertain terms. He literally threatens the Dursleys on Harry's behalf. And then, when they go through this whole adventure, at the end of it, they go to find the Horcruxes. Ron is the one who says, oh, hey, guess what? You have no idea what you're doing. This morning we asked the question, is Harry Potter a leader? And I think unequivocally the narrative tells us, no, he is not. Why? Because the very people who are closest to him also recognize he doesn't know what he's doing. This is why I continue to come back to Hermione is actually the real point of that triangle. She's the top point, not a side point. And then finally, we get to Harry's social privilege. And the first instance of Harry's social privilege is actually the worst, because Harry tries to deflect his privilege and it's thrust back upon him. And it happens at the end of the first book. where Harry recognizes, oh, Hermione, you're better at literally everything than me. And Hermione says, oh no, I'm just books and cleverness. There are more important things, Harry, like being a white dude. Harry is always in the narrative treated this much better than everybody else. First to Mr. Ronald Weasley, I award 50 points. Then to Miss Hermione Granger, who saves 2 people's lives during this adventure, I award 50 points. And then to Harry Potter, because he's Harry Potter, you get 60. He gets 10 extra points out of nowhere because he is Harry Potter. By The Prisoner of Azkaban, people start to notice. Ron's like, hey, wait a second. These guys had the Marauders map this whole time and they didn't give it to me. Well, you're not the hero of this story. By Goblet of Fire, Hermione is like, look, Ron's right. Like, you're his best friend and you're all famous and stuff and like everybody likes you and it's cool and he's got a reason to be pissed at you and I can't tell you that because then you won't talk to me either because that's what kind of 4th year crybaby you are right now. So I'm not going to say anything. Hermione has to explain Harry's social privilege because he has absolutely zero self-awareness, which is, again, the privilege of privilege. The privilege of privilege is never having to acknowledge it at all. And then, in Order of the Phoenix, Hermione tries to warn him that he is not the great white savior. Don't you think you have a bit of like saving people thing? And Harry's like, yup, let's go. And so then they do, and Sirius dies. Even Snape has to remind Dumbledore, I didn't do any of this for Harry. And I know in Dumbledore's brain, everything always happens for Harry. But Snape's not about that, and that's not why he's here. And so when we begin to look at Harry at the end of this series, where Harry walks up to Voldemort after Sirius Black has died on his behalf, after his parents have died on his behalf, after Hedwig has died on his behalf, after Dobby, his freed slave, has died on his behalf, Harry can walk up to Voldemort and say, don't anybody try to help me. It's just me and you. And my question is, when has Harry done one single thing by himself that his institutionalized privilege has not already done for him? And we use this as a model for critical whiteness theory because in our society, the narrative that is perfectly acceptable within our culture is for people who were born on third base to get to treat every single like a home run. That's the narrative of our culture, that we have this even playing field and I succeeded, so why can't you, without any examination whatsoever of the institutionalized kinds of racial privilege that have put me on a different starting point. So that when I say, it's just me and you, nobody help me, we don't have to talk about all of the people that have already helped you. We don't have to talk about all of the systems that were put in place specifically to help you. We don't have to talk about all of those things you just get because you were born you. And Harry gets to say, I didn't ask for any of this. And just like when we talk about whiteness in our actual society, nobody cares what you asked for. You benefit from particular kinds of privilege whether you want it or don't want it. What you think about it, what you feel about it, what you believe in is irrelevant. Systems of privilege do not require your belief, nor do they require your consent. They operate on your behalf, whether you want them to or not. And Harry gets to the end of this tale as the main character hero of the story on the backs of hundreds of people who will never get credit for what they have done to get him there. Just like white privilege. Have a good afternoon.